How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. It's raining in Los Angeles. Thank you, God. Thank you so much. Hopefully that will do away with the last vestiges of the fires in Palisades and Pasadena, which I checked today. It said, one was 85% contained, the other was 92% contained. Not sure exactly what contained means. I would have hoped it was just out, but I think it means that, they've surrounded it. It's not spreading anymore for the most part, but I would please God with this rain, it should be just over. Who's in the house? Bella in Florida, Yehuda in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck Guy in Ohio, Yosef in Sierra Nevada, Shandor in the Bronx, Belle in Texas, Sharon in New Jersey, Bill in Atlanta, Georgia, Paula in the Great Northwest, Nancy in North Carolina, Joe in the Inland Empire, Lucy in Minnesota, Bill saying hallelujah for the rains, amen. Chaim in Florida, Alan in New York City, Ifa in Florida. Welcome everybody. Big dafs every time here in Sanhedrin. Let's get busy. Our daf today is page 35 here in Tractate Sanhedrin, 24th volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 4, talking about the deliberations of a court, whether for a case of monetary law or a capital law case. The Mishnah teaches, we're at the very bottom of page 34b. The Mishnah teaches, so back to this Mishnah number 1 in chapter 4, in cases of capital law, the court judges during the daytime and concludes the deliberations and issues the ruling in the daytime. And the Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? And Rav Shimi Bar Chiya says, the verse states with regard to Israelites who worship the idol of Peor in the wilderness and hang them onto the Lord facing the sun. So we're translating the word hoka as hang, like execute them by hanging. In Numbers 25:4, and this indicates that capital cases are judged in the face of the sun, i.e. during the day. So this incident, it's just so inexplicable and terrible, right? The children of Israel in the wilderness, God brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with signs and wonders, 10 plagues, parting the sea. appearing in person, so to speak, at Mount Sinai, giving the commandments, giving the Torah, feeding us every day with manna, and giving us water to drink in the desert from the fountain of Miriam, associated with Miriam's merit, and the clouds of glory, keeping a nice, perfect air-conditioned temperature, even in the midst of the hot desert. And under all those conditions, with so much to be grateful for, some little segment of the people was worshiping idols, turning to this, false deity Peor that neighboring peoples would worship. What was going on? It was a huge offense, an affront to the Holy One, blessed be He. Idolatry is a sin that is not tolerated in Israel, would not be tolerated in Israel. We cannot tolerate. The Torah could not be more emphatic that kind of a sin is likened to murder and rape. Okay, so the people who were doing that, they needed to be removed lest the anger of the Lord burn at the entire nation. These people had to be, tried and executed and removed from the encampment in the wilderness. Why would they commit this sin? Probably had something to do with sexual lust and desire. That's how the Midianite women were, sent to seduce some of the Jews, pick them off, so to speak, after the king Balak tried to hire the prophet Bilam to curse the people. Bilam said, I can't curse them. God blesses them. Can't curse them. But you could try this, right? And getting people to seduce them and pick them off through their evil inclination was successful, for a very small segment of the people, but it was successful. Okay, so the ones who committed that crime, they needed to be hung, and that needed to happen during the day, and hang them onto the Lord facing the sun. Sounds like during the day. Now on page 35a. And it is written, quote, and Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it. Let me just finish this. And Rav Chisda says, okay, so hang them facing the sun. Rav Chisda says, from where is it derived that this word, hoka'ah, is hanging? Well, he derives it from an incident in 2 Samuel chapter 21, 6, verse 6, where the Gibeonites requested to be given the sons of King Saul, as it is written, Vehoka unto the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And it is written, and Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for her upon the rock from the beginning of harvest until water was poured upon them from heaven. And she suffered neither the birds of the air to rest on them by day, nor the beasts of the field by night. We see that in 2 Samuel 21:10. And it is clear from this verse that the bodies of the children of Saul remained exposed outdoors, and presumably they were hung. That episode is quite perplexing. It's in 2 Samuel chapter 21. It's not exact. Not all the details are filled in, but the very quick summary is that Saul, he was not destined to remain king of Israel. He had many transgressions. He was a weak king. He was jealous of the national hero David, perhaps with good reason, since David ended up getting elevated to be the king. And the throne would not depart from the descendants of David, unlike Saul, who was not able to transmit the throne even one generation to his son Jonathan. But while he was king, Saul did a bunch of bad things, including in trying to wipe out David and the threat that he perceived from David. He killed people who he thought were helping David, including a whole city of priests. And these Gibeonites, our sages teach, were sort of like workers in this priestly city who got swept up in Saul's wrath. And he, killed these people totally illegally. Well, Saul ended up being killed himself, and now there's a new king in England, king in Israel, which would be King David. But it was like the nation and the land bore this blood guilt from these crimes of the previous king, of Saul. And David sought to make it right, because he said, listen, to the families of these people who were killed, what can we do to make it right? It was not our decision. It was not this administration, so to speak. It was the previous administration that committed this terrible sin. What can we do to make it right? And they said, well, we have no beef with you, but from that king's family, we want justice. And what did David do? He ended up sending some of the grandchildren of Saul to these Gibeonites, who executed them as a matter of sort of blood revenge, kind of feuding blood revenge. Totally kind of an extrajudicial matter. But King David, who was a prophet, saw that this was the correct thing to do. And after it was done, there was peace in the land. And not just peace, but a kind of supernatural peace, where the land was having problems, and they no longer had those problems once they ameliorated this blood guilt that the nation and the land were carrying because of the sins of Saul. So the sins of Saul were very much visited upon his grandchildren. And that's why God says, right, that he rewards the righteous for 1,000 generations. But the sins of the wicked, get punished to the 3rd and 4th generations. And our sages teach in many places that that's not, that God comes in and smites the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It's that when you behave wickedly, it's a natural consequence that your grandchildren and great-grandchildren will suffer. And here it happened. That was one example of that. At any rate, we're just reading that here because of this idea that when there's a capital law case, if the defendant is found guilty and he needs to be executed, that has to happen during the daytime. And now we're working our way back to say the law we've already heard a bunch of times, that in a capital law case, they have the trial. If they finish in one day, great. If it takes 2 days, whatever. When it's finished, then they deliberate on it. And if they come to a guilty verdict, they have to sleep on that verdict and issue it the next day. It can't be on the same day, nor can it be issued at night. That's where we're headed. So the Gemara discusses the incident of the Israelites who worshiped the idol of Peor in the wilderness. And it is written, and the Lord said unto Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and hang them unto the Lord facing the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. Right now we're going back 400 years to the children in the wilderness coming out of Egypt, and this incident with a few of them pursuing idolatry in the name of this false god Peor. Numbers 25:4. So the Gemara asks, if the nation transgressed, in what manner did the chiefs of the people transgress? The verse does not record a transgression of the chiefs, so why were they punished? And Rav Yehuda says that Rav says the reason for selecting the chiefs of the tribes was not to punish them. Rather, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, apportion courts for the chiefs of the tribes, and each court will judge and punish the transgressors of its tribe. And the Gemara asked, well, what is the reason that multiple courts were needed for this? Why not just have one court to hear all these cases? So if we say that it is due to the principle that a court does not judge 2 cases of capital law in one day, which is the law, and there were many cases to be judged, well, actually, that cannot be the reason. Why? But doesn't Rav Hizda say the principle was taught only with regard to 2 different types of death imposed by a court, as each case needs sufficient time to fully investigate on its own merits? But the court does judge multiple cases of one type of death, i.e. one transgression on the same day. In other words, all these people were guilty of the same crime of worshiping this Peor in the wilderness. So it's the same crime, same punishment. There you can, have a bunch of multiple defendants having the same trial in the same court on the same day because they're all being tried for the same crime. Now the Gemara explains, so rather the reason for the appointment of multiple courts was in order that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. The fierce anger of God would remain until those who engaged in idol worship were punished. Therefore, it was necessary to try them in due haste. Right? God was very angry with the Jewish people, even though it was a small percentage of them who had committed this sin. It was like a plague broke out among the people. Also, perhaps suggesting that we all share in responsibility for each other, and maybe only a few of them were doing idolatry, but what was everybody else doing? Not stopping them. Okay, well, or sometimes when the Lord's anger burns at some segment of the population, it comes, right? It comes, and people get caught up in the conflagration, which, we've seen many times in history. So the nation needed to act. They needed to get this blood guilt out of the nation of these idolaters, and so they convened a bunch of courts simultaneously to get the job done. New subject. The Mishnah teaches, in cases of monetary law, the court may conclude the deliberations and issue the ruling, even on that same day, whether to exempt the accused or to find him liable. In cases of capital law, the court may conclude the deliberations and issue the ruling, even on the same day, to acquit the accused. But the court must wait until the following day to find him liable. And the Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? What is our source? Rabbi Hanina said, the verse states prophetically concerning Jerusalem after the destruction of the first temple, she that was full of justice, righteousness lodged in her. But now murderers, Isaiah 1:21. So the verse associates lodging or waiting overnight with justice. And Rava says that these matters are derived from here, right? So Rabbi Hanina is saying this is the source for you can acquit on the same day, you have to wait till the next day, you have to sleep on it to hold the accused liable. Rava finds it in a different source where it says, learn to dwell, seek judgment, relieve the oppressed. So relieve ashru, the oppressed, chamotz. That's Isaiah 1:17. And this is interpreted as praise ashru, the judge who delays mechametz, his verdict, before he pronounces it. We don't want to delay justice, but when we're going to execute somebody, we want to slow that down and make sure it's the right verdict. And the other Amora, Rabbi Hanina, who did not derive this law from the same verse as Rava, he interprets that Rava's verse in a different way. He says, relieve the robbery victim, chamotz, but not the robber, chometz, as do the wicked judges. And the Gemara asks, and the other Amora, Rava, what does he do with this verse? She that was full of justice, righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers? And the Gemara answers, Rava interprets it in accordance with the statement that Rabbi Lazar says that Rabbi Yitzchak says. As Rabbi Lazar says that Rabbi Yitzchak says, every fast day on which the distribution of charity is left overnight, this is considered as if one spilled the blood of the poor people. As they fasted all day in the hope that they would receive charity before the day was over in order to purchase food. In fact, it says as they fasted all day in the expectation that they would receive charity before the day was over in order to purchase food with which to break their fasts. If you withhold charity from them on that day, it's like you're killing them. It's equivalent to killing them. As it is stated, she that was full of justice, tzedek, compared to charity, tzedakah, righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. So the Gemara clarifies, and this statement applies with regard to the delaying of the distribution of bread and dates, which are ready to be consumed so the poor can break their fast. But with regard to the delaying of the distribution of money, wheat, and barley, it's not a problem because they can't break their fast with that. They would still have other steps, either purchasing food or baking it into bread, etc. They couldn't be relying on that to break their fast. But if they were relying on actual food to come their way to break their fast, do not delay that. Okay, new subject. After teaching that in cases of capital law, the verdict may not be issued on the same day as the deliberations. The Mishnah stated, therefore, the court does not judge cases of capital law on certain days of the week. It just says on certain days. Neither on the eve of Shabbos, nor on the eve of a festival. So the Gemara asks, what is the reason for this? What does the law that the verdict may not be issued on the same day as the deliberations have to do with not judging cases on these days that have been mentioned? So the Gemara explains, it is because it is not possible to conduct the trial on the eve of Shabbos. So the eve of Shabbos, Erev Shabbos means Friday. Right? That starts Thursday night, but normally what we're really talking about is Friday day and really Friday afternoon. Right? So prior to the onset of Shabbos. So if we say that we would judge him on Erev Shabbos and conclude his verdict on Erev Shabbos, well, how can we do that? Perhaps we would see a reason to find the accused liable. And we know that we have to sleep on it. So we couldn't issue this guilty verdict on the same day. And in this situation, the court is required to perform a suspension of the trial until the following days. The court may not issue a verdict in cases of capital on the same day as the deliberations. So then we'd have to issue the verdict on Shabbos. Well, if we say we should judge him on Erev Shabbos and conclude the verdict on Shabbos, and if he is found liable, kill him on Shabbos, well, that cannot be done, as the murder, which in this case means execution, of one liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment does not override Shabbos. And if we say we should kill him at night after the conclusion of Shabbos, that cannot be done, as we require that the capital punishment be administered facing the sun during the daytime. And if we were to say we should judge him on Erev Shabbos, conclude his verdict on Shabbos, and execute him on Sunday, well, then you are found to have caused a delay in his verdict, as the accused will have to wait overnight knowing that he is condemned to death. And if we say we should judge him on Shabbos, on Erev Shabbos, and conclude his verdict on Sunday, well, the judges will forget their reasons for their positions in the interim. And even though two judges' scribes are standing before them and they write the statements of those who acquit the accused and the statements of those who find him liable, and they write that which emerged from the mouths of the judges, i.e. their tentative verdict, well, the hearts of people, and Ashe, are forgetful, Inshe, and they will forget the reasons. Therefore, it is not possible to begin deliberations in cases of capital law on Erev Shabbos or Erev Yom Tov. Right? So you could start a case on Thursday, but you don't start a case on Friday for these reasons, a capital law case. Now, the Gemara discusses a related matter. Reish Lakish said to Rabbi Yochanan, and the burial of a corpse with no one to bury it. Right? So this is the meis mitzvah. Meis is a corpse, mitzvah, a commandment. The commandment of the corpse is what? If there's an unattended corpse, you bury it. That's a major, major commandment and a major, major righteous deed, that if there is a body with no one to attend to burying it, so you stop whatever you're doing and you bury that body to honor the dead and to honor the vessel that carried around a soul, which is a piece of God. All of us are souls. We are all sparks of God in that way. We have bodies. The body is sacred because it carries around that sacred, that piece of holiness, that soul for a lifetime. And then when the soul departs, we respectfully attend to that sacred vessel, the body, by burying it. That is the Jewish way. And this is so important that if there is no one to bury that body and you happen to be the guy, so you go bury that body. And that's true even if you're the high priest. A Kohen Gadol, the high priest, is not allowed to become impure for the dead, having contact with a dead body, walking over a grave, dealing with the corpse, actually touching it to put it inside the grave. A Kohen Gadol is absolutely prohibited to do that while the oil of anointment is on him, right? While he is serving as the Kohen Gadol. He can't even do that for close family members. But for a stranger that he's never met, that is a meis mitzvah, an unattended corpse, even he becomes impure for the dead to bury that body. And likewise, a nazir. A nazir, right, is one who took a vow of naziris for a certain period of time, standard length 30 days, to abstain from all products of the grapevine, whether wine or wine vinegar or grapes themselves, not to cut his hair during that period, and not to become impure for the dead, even for very close relatives. But if he's the one who comes upon this unattended corpse, he makes himself impure for the dead so that he can bury that body. Okay, why are we talking about a meis mitzvah? Because we're going to learn out certain parallel laws of the meis mitzvah and executing a condemned person and disposing of the body of the one who was executed. Let's get into it. Okay. Reish Lakish said to Rabbi Yochanan, and the burial of a corpse with no one to bury it, the meis mitzvah, should override Shabbos by means of a kal v'chomer inference. Okay? So the meis mitzvah, the body that needs to be buried, we should even bury it on Shabbos. Why? Let's see. If with regard to the temple service, which does override Shabbos, right? There was the daily offerings, the regular offerings, the 2 lambs that are brought every day of the year, even on Shabbos, and the additional offering of Shabbos. Okay, so these were offerings that were brought on Shabbos, where normally you don't do work and you don't kindle fire, but these offerings were brought on Shabbos. So those offerings override the prohibitions of Shabbos that otherwise we cannot slaughter and we cannot cook and we cannot kindle fire. For these offerings we do. So if with regard to the temple service, which overrides Shabbos, yet the burial of a meis mitzvah overrides it, what does that mean? Burial of a meis mitzvah overrides the temple service means that if there's only one priest available to do the temple service, but there's a meis mitzvah, he has to go and do bury the meis mitzvah, bury the meis, even if it means that an offering won't be brought that day. Yet the burial of the meis mitzvah overrides it, which is based on the interpretation of the term written with regard to a nazir. So how do we know that the meis mitzvah overrides the temple service? We actually look at the law of the nazir. How does that work? Well, about the nazir, it says that he will not become impure even for his close relatives. But then it lists examples of those relatives: his father, his mother, his brother, his sister. Now, once we know that he doesn't become impure for his brother, so why do we also have to list the sister? I mean, brother is different than parents. Okay, we're certainly learning something there. But once we know he doesn't become impure for the brother, why would we think that he would become impure for this? That he would become impure to bury his sister? So with regard to the nazir, where it says or for his sister, Numbers 6:7, and here the Gemara pauses its recounting of the question of Reish Lakish and cites a baraisa that teaches this law about the temple service overriding. The meis mitzvah overriding the temple service, as we're learning it out from the nazir. How does that work? As it is taught in a baraisa, the verses state with regard to a nazir, quote, all the days that he consecrates himself unto the Lord, he shall not come near to a dead body. He shall not make himself impure for his father or for his mother, for his brother or for his sister when they die. That's Numbers 6, verses 6 and 7. Why must the verse state all of these relatives? It teaches that if a nazir was going to slaughter his paschal offering, the Pesach, right, Passover offering, or to circumcise his son. Okay, those are very important mitzvahs. We circumcise our sons on the 8th day, and if the 8th day falls on Shabbos, we do the bris on Shabbos. That's very much overriding Shabbos, when normally we would not draw blood, which a circumcision does. So the bris overrides Shabbos. Okay, and of course, the commemorating the Exodus from Egypt, bringing the Pesach, now that's replaced by our Seders on Passover when the temple was standing. all the people would make the pilgrimage up to Jerusalem, register in groups, that a group would all be registered to a particular lamb that was brought as a sacrifice on that day, slaughtered in the temple courtyard, its blood sprinkled on the altar, and then brought back to where that group was going to eat their Passover dinner, and they would all eat from that roasted Passover lamb. Super important mitzvahs. Okay, but it teaches that if a nazir was going to slaughter his Pesach or to make a bris on his son, and he heard that a relative of his died, one might have thought that he should return and become tameh, become ritually impure to bury the relative. So you said he shall not make himself impure. So the death of his relative will not override so significant a mitzvah from the Torah. Now on page 35b. And one might have thought, well, just as he may not become impure to bury his sister, so he may not become impure to bury a meis mitzvah, the unattended corpse. Therefore, the verse states specifically, or for his sister, teaching that he may not become impure only to bury his sister, as others can attend to her burial, but he may become impure to bury a meis mitzvah. Right? So, I mean, if it happened to be a relative, but there was no one else to bury it, yes, then he buries. The point is, if there's an unattended corpse that no one else will bury, he must bury it. Even though that would normally, as a nazir, he wouldn't touch any dead body, not even his mother, father, brother, or sister. But for the unattended corpse, he does. Having cited this baraisa, wait a second. Yeah, so having cited the baraisa that the burial of a meis mitzvah overrides the temple service, Reish Lakish continues his suggestion. So, with regard to Shabbos, which is overridden due to the temple service, is it not logical that the burial of a meis mitzvah overrides it? Right? So if burying the meis mitzvah overrides the temple service, and the temple service overrides Shabbos, so transitive quality, the meis mitzvah should override Shabbos. Okay? So Rabbi Yochanan, we know the meis mitzvah overrides the temple service, and the temple service overrides Shabbos, so the meis mitzvah should override Shabbos. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan said to him, the laws of murder, i.e., the obligation to execute one found liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment, proves that this is not the case, as it overrides the temple service. For example, if the only priest present is liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment, he is nonetheless taken to be executed, despite the fact that this will result in the negation of the temple service until another priest is found. But executing the condemned does not override Shabbos. We don't execute a person who was convicted in court of a capital crime. We don't do that execution on Shabbos. Now the Gemara asks, well, murder itself should override Shabbos, meaning executing one who is guilty of murder, should override Shabbos based on this Kal V'chomer inference. Just as with regard to the temple service, which overrides Shabbos, nevertheless, murder overrides it. And the source for this is, as it is stated, and if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, you shall take him from my altar, that he may die. Right? So if the murderer, and there was an episode like this, I think in the book of Judges, right, where, or actually I think maybe in the book of Kings, I think maybe Solomon sent to have someone executed, and he was trying to avoid being executed by running into the temple and holding the horns of the altar, right? That we were just talking about yesterday and the day before, that, you know, anything that touches the Mizbeach, the altar in the holy temple, becomes sanctified. So you might think that, you know, like that's some kind of sanctuary that we're not going to, take a man who's actually clinging to the horns of the altar and take him out to be executed. But the Torah tells you specifically, even from the horns of the altar, you will remove somebody who is condemned to execution and execute him. Right? That's specifically stated in the Torah. Exodus 21:14. So then, with regard to Shabbos, which is overridden due to the temple service, right? We bring the regular daily sacrifices even on Shabbos. Is it not logical that murder should override it, right? So if the temple service overrides Shabbos and executing a murderer overrides the temple service, then why wouldn't you execute a murderer on Shabbos? And Rava said in response, it has already been ruled by a Tana of the school of Rabbi Yishmael, as the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught. What is the meaning when the verse states, you shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations on the Shabbos day? Exodus 35:3. This means all labor is forbidden on Shabbos. I'm sorry. What does it mean that you shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations on the Shabbos day? Why do we need this, given that all labor is already forbidden on Shabbos? Based on the verse, Exodus 20, verse 10, in it, you shall do no manner of work. You shall not do any manner of work. So kindling a fire is considered one of the 39 malachos, one of the forms of work. Since we already know you can't do any work on Shabbos, why does the Torah then go and specify that you shall not kindle fire in your habitations? It has to be to tell us, we already know it's prohibited. So why is it singled out and sort of repeated in that sense? Why do we need this extra information? It must be that God is teaching us something with this specification. And at this point, the Gemara interjects. What is the meaning when the verse states this? If this question is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, this transgression was singled out to teach that one who lights a fire on Shabbos violates an ordinary prohibition as opposed to the performance of other types of labor on Shabbos for which one is liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment. Right? So here it's actually Rabbi Yosef saying, okay, the actual penalty for desecrating Shabbos, which tragically, the vast majority of Jews who are ignorant of Torah law are doing in this day and age, sadly, not because they mean to. So many of them just don't even know any better, though they should. Okay, but and I don't know if, except in the wilderness when these laws were first given, and there was the incident of the wood gatherer who was executed for desecrating Shabbos. But since then, probably nobody's ever been executed for desecrating Shabbos. Makes no difference. We have to understand what the actual law is, even though we might not enforce that death penalty, because the person would have to be warned in the presence of witnesses that if you do that, you're going to be liable for desecrating Shabbos. And then he goes ahead and does it anyway, right then and there. And then no other reason could be found to exonerate him. Nevertheless, we are meant to understand that desecrating Shabbos is a really big deal. Death penalty offense. Rabbi Yosef says, okay, well, there's many different ways to violate Shabbos, to desecrate Shabbos. Kindling fire is specified either to tell you, and this is an example of all those ways, or to say, for this particular one, if you do it, you are liable for desecrating Shabbos, which is death penalty offense, and for violating an ordinary prohibition, or possibly you are liable for desecrating Shabbos, but the punishment for kindling a fire in your home is not the death penalty, but rather something else, like violating an ordinary prohibition would be lashes. Okay? So let's see what he's saying. So if this question, that would be Rabbi Yosef's point of view. If this question is asked in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Nassan, well, this transgression of kindling fire in a home on Shabbos was singled out from among all the other kinds of work to divide the various labors and to establish liability to receive court-imposed capital punishment for performance of any one of them. It was to tell you that if you do any of these things, you could receive that death penalty. And the Gemara explains, as it is taught in a Baraisa, kindling a fire was singled out to teach that one who lights a fire on Shabbos violates an ordinary prohibition. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Nassan says it was singled out to divide between the various labors. Either way, it is clear what the meaning of the verse is. Just want to make sure I understand. All right, so we're still trying to figure out why we don't execute a condemned murderer on Shabbos, right? We're starting. Why doesn't it work that if the temple service overrides Shabbos and killing a condemned murderer overrides a temple service, why don't we execute a condemned murderer on Shabbos? Okay, let's get back to that. So the Gemara clarifies. Rather, Rava said the term habitations in the verse poses a difficulty for the Tana. Right, we're not discussing why is kindling a fire singled out for the general laws of Shabbos. We're getting back to our discussion here. The term habitations in this verse, you shall kindle no fire in your habitations. This is what poses a difficulty for the Tana. What is the meaning when the verse states, you shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations on the Sabbath day? After all, Shabbos is an obligation on the person himself, not an obligation that is bound to any specific location. And the law is that an obligation on the person himself is practiced whether in the land of Israel or outside the land of Israel. A Jew is not permitted to kindle a fire on the Sabbath day, which includes turning light switches on and off, whether he's in Israel or whether he's outside of Israel. The laws of Shabbos are the same in Israel and out of Israel. We already know that, because it's an obligation on the person himself. It's not tied to the land. So, why didn't it just say, you shall kindle no fire on the Sabbath day? Why did it say, you shall kindle no fire in your habitations on the Sabbath day? What is God teaching us with habitations? Why do I need the term habitations that the merciful one writes in the Torah? So Rava explains. One student said in the name of Rabbi Yishmael that since it is stated in Deuteronomy 21:22, quote, and if there is in a man a sin deserving of death, and he is put to death. So that's the end quote. So from this, I would derive that the court administers capital punishment both during the week, the days of the week, and on Shabbos. And accordingly, how do I realize the meaning of what the verse states concerning Shabbos? Everyone that desecrates it shall be put to death in Exodus 31:14. One possibility is that the term desecration of Shabbos applies only to other cases in which labor is performed and excludes instances of the death penalty administered by a court, which is not a desecration of Shabbos, right? The court is going to kill someone. The court is going to shed blood. But the court is shedding blood according to Torah law, right? In order to follow Torah law. So if we're saying it's not permitted to shed blood on Shabbos, like you can't slaughter an animal, so they, like, let's say you can't cook anyway, but let's say you were willing to eat raw meat, right? So are you permitted to shecht an animal, to slaughter it, and then, cut off strips of meat and eat it on Shabbos? No, because one of the kinds of work is slaughter and drawing blood, and we don't do that on Shabbos. But you might have thought that since a court is executing a condemned criminal, in order to follow the law, not to break it, that this would be an exception to the prohibition on shedding blood on Shabbos. You might have thought this, right? Or rather, you could derive that even the death penalty administered by a court is prohibited as desecration of Shabbos. So then how do I realize the meaning of, and he is put to death? So one possibility is that the mitzvah of executing transgressors applies on weekdays, but not on Shabbos. We are not meant to fulfill that obligation on Shabbos. Or perhaps the other possibility is that it applies even on Shabbos, right? So is it that we override the prohibition and we execute a murderer on Shabbos? Or is it that we don't even have that commandment on Shabbos because executing, criminals is not something we do on Shabbos, right? Is it that it overrides Shabbos, or is it that we're not commanded to do it on Shabbos? As these verses can be interpreted in either manner, the verse states, "You shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations on Shabbos day." And there, with regard to the punishment administered to a murderer, the verse states, "And these shall be for you a statute of judgment throughout your generations in all your habitations." Why is habitations mentioned there? Who's, executing a murderer with court-imposed capital punishment in his house? Obviously, we don't do that in our houses, but the verse mentions in your habitations. Why? Must be to connect us to "you shall kindle no fire in your habitations on Shabbos." So it must be teaching us that we don't conduct executions of convicted murderers on Shabbos. So just as the term habitations that is stated there is referring to the act of a court, so too the term habitations that is stated here concerning Shabbos is referring to the act of a court. And the merciful one states, "You shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations," to teach us that the court does not administer capital punishment on Shabbos. Entre paréntesis, as we say in Spanish, in passing, I'm just relaying a teaching that I have heard. I heard it from the Biala Rebbe, that, nothing is a sure thing, right? Just because your house has a mezuzah on it doesn't mean that, God forbid, something bad won't happen in your house. But having a mezuzah on your house adds to the protection that the Lord provides over a Jewish home. And you should make sure to always have a mezuzah on your house, and in fact on all the doorways of your house, except doorways to bathrooms and closets. And keeping Shabbos, and particularly lighting Shabbos candles before Shabbos, is a protection against fire. It's a protection against fire. If you keep Shabbos, nothing's a guarantee, but it is a very strong measure of protection for a Jewish home that you keep Shabbos and that you light candles before Shabbos, because "you shall kindle no fire" on the Sabbath day keeps fire away from the house. Abaye says, "Now that you have said that murder of one condemned by the court does not override Shabbos, so one should say that murder, meaning execution of a murderer, does not override the performance of the temple service either, based on the Kal Vachomer. And just as with regard to Shabbos, which is overridden for the performance of the temple service, and yet execution of the murderer does not override it, then with regard to performance of the temple service, which does override Shabbos, is it not logical that murder should not override it?" And the Gemara questions this inference. But if so, how would one explain that which is written in the verse concerning one liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment? "You shall take him from my altar, that he may die." That seems to teach explicitly, execution of the murderer overrides the temple service. You shall even take him from the altar. This verse indicates that the court administering capital punishment does override the performance of the temple service. And the Gemara explains that verse serves to teach the law concerning an offering of an individual, which does not override Shabbos. The verse is teaching that the court takes the priest to execute him, even if this will result in the offering of an individual not being sacrificed, but perhaps would not take him if that would result in a communal offering, one of the regular daily offerings of the nation not being offered. Perhaps we would not take him from the altar for that reason. Rava says, if that is so, one should say that murder should not override even an offering of an individual based on the Kal Vachomer inference, down on page 36a. Just as with regard to a festival which is overridden, due to an offering of an individual, as voluntary offerings of individuals are sacrificed on festivals, and nevertheless, murder does not override it, as the court does not execute one liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment on a festival. So with regard to an offering of an individual, which overrides a festival, is it not logical that murder should not override it? Therefore, unlike the explanation of Abaye, the court should not take a priest to him in the event he is liable to receive capital punishment, if this will result in the offering even of an individual not being sacrificed on the altar. And Rava clarifies this works out well, according to the one who says that vow offerings and gift offerings of individuals are not sacrificed on a festival. Since the offerings of an individual do not override a festival, there is no place for this kal v'chomer inference. But according to the one who says that vow offerings and gift offerings of individuals are sacrificed on a festival, what is there to say? Why would one not make the above kal v'chomer inference? Answer, we don't make it because the offerings of an individual do not override the festival. They would be brought on the intermediate days of the festival, Chol HaMoed. Keep going, get a little jump on tomorrow. So rather, Rava says that Abaye's explanation of the verse is incorrect according to all opinions. It is not necessary to say that the inference is incorrect according to the one who says that vow offerings and gift offerings of individuals are sacrificed on a festival, as according to that opinion, one cannot justify the verse from my altar, meaning execution of a murderer does override the temple service at all, as there is no distinction between the offering of an individual and a communal offering, as both override a festival, according to that view. So accordingly, court-imposed capital punishment should not override either type of offering. But even according to the one who says that vow offerings and gift offerings of individuals are not sacrificed on a festival, and they're not, in which case Abaye's explanation is possible, it's still difficult, but isn't it written from my altar? And the term my altar indicates my altar, God's altar, the offering that is designated to me, meaning God. And what offering is this? It is the daily offering. And yet the merciful one states, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. Accordingly, the verse is not stated specifically with regard to an offering of individual. We're saying that it overrides even communal offerings. New subject. The Mishna teaches that in cases of monetary law, we're back to our Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 4. In cases of monetary law, and likewise in the cases of ritual impurity and purity, the judges commence expressing their opinions from the greatest of the judges. Right? So we start with the most senior, most learned of the judges on the panel. He speaks first in the deliberations. Rav says, I was among the quorum of judges in the school of Rebbe, and they would commence from me, i.e., I was first when ascertaining the opinions of the judges. And the Gemara questions this statement, but we learned in the Mishnah that the judges commence expressing their opinions from the greatest of the judges. And Rav, at that time, was one of the junior judges of that court. So Rabba, the son of Rava, says, and some say that it was Rabbi Hillel, the son of Rabbi Valis, who says, the counting of the vote in the court in the school of Rebbe is different, as all of their deliberations and the counting of the vote would commence from the side benches where the least significant judges sit. Why? And this was because Rebbe was held in such high esteem that once he expressed his opinion, no one would be so brazen as to contradict him. So just to have a fair deliberation, he had to go last. Because if he spoke first, everyone would be like, oh, I didn't realize it was like that. Okay, I agree with Rebbe. There'd be no deliberation. So he had to go last. And with regard to the greatness of Rebbe, Rabba, the son of Rava, says, and some say that it was Rabbi... I just said that. Oh, no. It's not. Rabba, the son of Rava, says, and some say that it was Rabbi Hillel, the son of Rabbi Valis, who says, from the days of Moses and until the days of Rebbe, we do not find unparalleled greatness in Torah knowledge and unparalleled greatness in secular matters, including wealth and high political office, combined in one place, i.e., in a single individual. Right? From Moses to Rebbe, you don't have that the most learned and most gifted as a leader is all in the same person, right? Not from Moses until Rebbe. The Gemara asks, whoa. But was there not such a person? Wasn't there Joshua, who was unparalleled in both domains. He was the most learned man. After Moses died, the leader of the nation was Joshua, who both knew the most Torah and was the most gifted leader, who was, receiving instruction about how to lead the Jewish people directly from God. So why wouldn't we say that it was in him, that he was the supreme in both areas? And the Gemara answers, well, during the time of Joshua, there was Elazar, right? Elazar was the high priest, the son of Aaron, who was Joshua's equal in Torah knowledge, right? Elazar and Joshua learned the Torah from Moses and Aaron, right? The previous generation. Elazar was right there with Joshua. So the Gemara asks, but wasn't there Pinchas, right? Pinchas was the son of Elazar, the grandson of Aaron, who outlived Elazar. And the Gemara answers, well, there were the elders who were equal to Pinchas in Torah knowledge. So then the Gemara says, well, come on, we can find somebody else who was the preeminent leader in both Torah knowledge and wealth and political power, everything in the generation. Wasn't there Saul, who was unparalleled in both domains? Saul? We began tonight by talking about the shortcomings of Saul. The Gemara answers, in Saul's time, there was Samuel, the prophet, who was Saul's equal in Torah knowledge. I would have to think exceeded Saul. The Gemara asks, but didn't Samuel die in Saul's lifetime, leaving Saul the leading figure in both domains? Gemara answers, we meant to say that from the days of Moses until the days of Rebbe, there was no other single individual who reigned supreme in Torah and greatness for all the years that he was the leader of the Jewish people. So the Gemara says, but what about David, King David, who was both the greatest Torah authority and the most powerful temporal authority of his day? The Gemara answers, there was Ira the Yairite, who was David's equal in Torah knowledge. And the Gemara objects, but didn't Ira the Yairite die in David's lifetime? And the Gemara answers, we meant to say that there was no other single individual who reigned supreme in Torah and greatness for all the years that he was the leader of the Jewish people. Gemara says, what about Solomon, who was unparalleled in both domains? And the Gemara answers, during his day, there was Shimi ben Gera, who was Solomon's master in Torah knowledge. And the Gemara objects, but didn't Solomon kill him at the beginning of his reign? See 1 Kings chapter 2. And the Gemara answers, we meant to say that there was no other single individual who reigned supreme in Torah and greatness for all the years that he was the leader of the Jewish people. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So the Gemara further objects, wasn't there Chizkiah, who was both the leading Torah scholar of his age and also the king of his people? And the Gemara answers, there was Shebna in that generation, who was Chizkiah's equal in Torah knowledge. And the Gemara says, but wasn't he killed in the war against Sennacherib? And the Gemara answers, we meant to say that there was no other single individual who reigned supreme in Torah and greatness for all the years that he was the leader of the Jewish people, like Moses and like Rebbe. All these other people had a period of being the supreme Torah leader and leader, but not for his whole time leading the people. And the Gemara, but the Gemara asked, but wasn't there Ezra, who was the greatest Torah sage of his day and the leader of the Jewish people? And the Gemara answers, yeah, but during Ezra's time, there was Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah, who was also his equal. And Rav Ada Bar Ahava says, I also say a similar statement, that from the days of Rebbe until the days of Rav Ashi, we do not find unparalleled greatness in Torah knowledge and unparalleled greatness in secular matters, including wealth and high political office, combined in one place, i.e. in a single individual. And the Gemara asks, but was there not such a person? But wasn't there Huna bar Nassan, who lived during the time of Rav Ashi and enjoyed both great Torah scholarship and great wealth? And the Gemara answers, Huna bar Nassan was subordinate to Rav Ashi, who was his superior in both domains. And that concludes our study for today. We got a nice jump on page 36, so we should be able to do a double daf tomorrow to help us catch up a little bit. But there won't be many double dafs in Sanhedrin, so we will just remain a little bit behind. Okay. Questions. Yosef, in cases of idolatry or a serious sin, Could there be an acquittal if one repented and received from the judge's mercy despite guilt? Would he then be declared righteous like they were innocent if they do? So no. So repentance is not something that a court evaluates, as far as I know. Maybe we'll see different here. I mean, did he commit the crime? Did witnesses testify that he committed the crime? And does the Torah mandate that that crime is a death penalty offense? If all these things are yes, then the court has to execute. Now, the court might find an out, that the witness testimony, is invalid. There's something wrong with it. There's a reason not to execute, and perhaps they'll look harder for that kind of an out. But we don't have it said that, that the judges in that day will look for a reason to acquit based on the person's teshuvah. Now, it may well be, like I said, there were a lot more murders in the land than, one execution per 70 years of any particular court. So there were a lot of people getting away with it. But those people were carrying that blood guilt on their hands, and we learn elsewhere that they would tend to meet an untimely end in some other way. God would even it out. If not in this life, certainly in the next. So any transgression that a person is carrying around, whether it's as serious as murder or, all the little things that we do, you're accountable for that. And we don't have exact justice in this world. We often see the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper, but we are all eternal souls. And God will make it exact. There will be exact justice for everybody, which we'll be able to understand when our souls depart from this world, and we can see how the whole thing works. And that's why, most people will have to spend some time in Gehenna, being punished and being refined of their sins before we can move on to the world of souls. So repentance and atonement is something that we all have to be involved in all the time, and especially if we've committed serious transgressions. But that is not what the court does. The court's job, is either to assess liability in monetary law cases or punishment in capital law cases. Bill, would that every leader made at least the effort to rule as David did in this instance, recognizing that, notwithstanding that we ourselves may not have committed the sins of our predecessors, that though we may not have blame, we do have responsibility. And even so, may they have the wisdom to recognize that, unlike David, they are not prophets and ought to be far more reticent in handing over blood for blood. Amen. Beautifully stated, beautiful prayer, Bill. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday, regular Monday time, 6 p.m.